So this session is called Mastering Misinformation. We're absolutely delighted to have back Professor Alex Edmans from the London Business School. And I'm just going to do a little bit of introduction in terms of ethical reading, and then we'll get on to the meat of the session with Alex. Before we get any further, I just want to thank our business partners for helping us and supporting us in terms of putting these webinars on and the other things we do. So a huge thank you to them. A little bit about ethical reading. We've been going since January 2018. We're a not-for-profit social enterprise, and our mission is to help embed ethics into the way businesses do work, the way they engage with their community as well, and thereby help make Reading just a better place to live and work. We want to do this by inspiring people that can make better choices, providing the tools and education, such as this webinar, to help them do that. And we want to work with others to achieve our goals. We run a whole series of events around some of our core programs, and collaboration, as I mentioned, is one of our core values, and we believe we can achieve a lot more by working together. In time, we hope that we can take what we're doing in Reading and help other places do similar things. So this is the Ethical Cities movement. So this is the introduction. I'm going to hand over to Alex. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so if you could hold off in terms of the questions. If you do have a question that comes to mind immediately, do put it on the chat window, and Professor Brad Hooker will be looking at those, and we'll make sure to raise them towards the end. Before further ado, I just want to introduce Alex. He is coming back to us. He's done a session for us before on the social responsibility of business and growing the pie mindset in terms of actually, allowing businesses to develop and grow in an ethical fashion. And actually that means that it's not a zero-sum game in terms of the benefits that we get. So we're delighted to have him back. He is Professor of Finance at the London Business School. He's a Reading lad, as I believe, from last time, Alex. He has a PhD from MIT, is a Fulbright Scholar, and was also a tenured professor at Wharton, an investment banker at Morgan Stanley, and lots of other things that he does. So a very busy chap, so we're very delighted and very lucky to have him. So I'm going to hand over to Alex now to present the talk. And as I said, we will have time for Q&A afterwards. Over to you, Alex.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Gurpreet, for hosting me. And thank you to everybody for joining and giving up an hour of your day to listen to me. So I know that people say thank you at the start of every talk, but this is a particular pleasure for me to speak to ethical Reading because I grew up in Reading. So I initially lived in Early. I went to Aldrington School. Then I went to Dolphin School and Montessori School in Hurst. We moved around a bit to Sonning and then Shinfield. I was a season ticket holder at Elm Park for a number of years and then the Medeski Stadium. And even when I left, I would come back and run the Reading Half Marathon for many years. So it's really great to have this connection. But that's not what you're here to listen about. So what you're here to listen about is misinformation, statistics, and evidence. And for me, data and evidence and statistics was my life until my son Casper was born. Now, the birth of a child is an incredible event, as some of you will have experienced. And luckily for us, it was uneventful, so the actual birth was rather hassle-free. But then when we brought him home, and when I shared the news with some of my friends, one friend who has 3 kids, he wrote back, "Now it's over, and now it starts." So we had to look after this little guy. And one of the questions was, well, what do we feed him? Now, to my wife and me, there seemed to be an obvious question with an obvious answer based on data and evidence and reliable information. Because we had taken a National Childbirth Trust parenting course. And this had a number of sessions on really important things like how to change a nappy and what do you do when your baby is sick. But there were 2 classes devoted to breastfeeding. And while much of those classes were on how to breastfeed, how to ensure a good latch, they started by explaining why breastfeed. The idea being that breastfeeding is tough, and so it can be that as a weary-eyed parent, you could be tempted to give in and to reach for the bottle. So if they could persuade you of the benefits of breastfeeding, then you would persevere even when things got difficult. And who do they quote as being the evidence for the benefits? Well, none other than perhaps the most reliable source, the World Health Organization. So they recommended exclusive breastfeeding. And what does exclusive mean? Without water, without any other fluids, no formula, exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. And there is a myriad of benefits. There could be physical benefits to the baby. There could be mental benefits to the baby. Also physical benefits to the mother, recovering from pregnancy, maternal-child bonding. This seemed to be as clear as day. And throughout the 114-slide PowerPoint deck, there were footnotes and references, so this had to be true. But as a self-respecting professor, I couldn't just take their word for it. I had to do some research myself. And back in the day, there was no ChatGPT, so Google was the next best option. And there's lots of benefits that there could be of breastfeeding. There's health benefits. But as a nerd, as a finance professor, I was particularly interested in the effect of breastfeeding on IQ. And so when I Googled breastfeeding IQ, I got clear results. Evidence from reliable sources like the BBC, which is impartial, suggested there is a link between breastfeeding and intelligence, not just looking at a dozen of babies, 3,500. Scroll down, you're going to find other studies saying the same thing. You come back another day, you find another study also finding a strong link between breastfeeding and IQ. So this confirmed everything that I thought to be true. There was clear evidence there on the benefits of breastfeeding. So my wife and I had a plan. We would breastfeed our son for 6 months exclusively, and he would be cleverer than anybody else within his nursery. And why stop at 6 months? Maybe we could breastfeed him for 16 months, and then he would be a genius. He would be able to help me with my academic research. But then, as a leading expert on breastfeeding, Mike Tyson, said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So what was the punching in the face for us? It was the fact that breastfeeding didn't always work. So in the first few days, my wife isn't producing too much breast milk, only colostrum. And so even after our son had drained her dry, he still wanted more. So what do you do in such a situation? It's not clear, because on the one hand, you might think it's obvious. You need to feed a hungry baby. But on the other hand, you might think it's obvious in the other direction. If the World Health Organization has told you nothing other than breast milk, then you shouldn't give formula. And isn't part of parenting to know when not to give in to your kids' requests. So because this was tricky, I then went back and did even more research myself. So I went back to the studies that I had seen in my search, but rather than just trusting the Google preview, I wanted to dig into the studies themselves. So I clicked on this link in the National Institutes of Health, and it said exactly what the Google preview said. So there was no deep fake here. There was no misinformation. Just exactly as Google said, more breastfed participants had high IQ scores than non-breastfed participants. But if you read just one line down, it says the following. Because of the small sample size, we could not confirm the significant difference between the breastfed and bottle-fed groups. So what this means is that even though there was a difference, it was so small, it could have been due to luck. So this was striking, like Google wasn't spreading misinformation. This was correct, but it didn't give the broader context because it had chopped off the next sentence. It didn't give you the full picture. Yes, there was a difference, but the difference was so small, it was not significant. And it gets even worse, because if you look to the top of the paragraph, you find references to another study. And this study looked at 5,500 children, and it concluded that breastfeeding had no significant effect on intelligence. So I was shocked. Because everybody tells you that breast is best. We'd heard this from doctors, we'd heard this from nurses, pediatricians, the National Childbirth Trust. We saw this in our Google searches. So why might this be the case? So there was a link here to footnote 18. So I thought, let me click on this and see what it is. And this is a study which seems to be respected. British Medical Journal. And it's freely accessible. It's not behind a paywall. So let me click on that study. And I did. And I was immediately accosted by long words that I don't understand, not being a medicine person. But I do understand numbers. So while I did not understand the medical terminology, I went to the tables, and this was one of the main tables. So what this did is it looked at the difference in IQ. So this PI80, that's an aptitude test, pretty much like an IQ test. And it looks at the differences in IQ between breastfed and bottle-fed kids. And it finds the difference is nearly 5 IQ points, which is not massive, but it's not small either. 5 points of IQ, that is something which is significant. And if you could add 5 points to your child's IQ just by switching up the feeding method, that is something that we should take seriously. But the astute among you will notice there's another word here, which is unadjusted. So what does that mean? And what would you need to adjust for? Well, here's the problem. So breastfed kids and bottle-fed kids, they differ along a number of dimensions, not just the feeding method. So breastfeeding is tough, as I mentioned earlier. It's hard to do without broader support. So maybe the women who are able to breastfeed are the ones with a supportive spouse. Maybe they can afford help outside the house. And maybe when they go back to work, they are executives who work in an office where they've got a pumping room and there's a fridge to store the milk. Maybe if you are working in a factory, you don't have the opportunity to express milk. So when they controlled for these other factors, what this means is when they stripped out the effect on IQ of these other factors, the mother's own IQ, the mother's education, family affluence, did the mother smoke, how old the mother was. After stripping out all of these other things, the link between breastfeeding and IQ was peanuts. It was 0.52. It was so small, it could be due to luck. So why is that so striking? Right, because the idea that breast is best, this often guilt trips mothers into thinking, I am a bad mother if I don't breastfeed. So even if I'm completely exhausted, I need to stay up and breastfeed because this is what the advice suggests. But when you look under the hood and you look at the data more carefully, you don't actually have such a strong relationship. So from that point on, my wife and I decided to do combination feeding. Yes, breast milk would be the first port of call. Yes, there are benefits like maternal child bonding, but if my wife needed a break or if Casper wanted a top up, maybe 1 feed in 5, we would use the bottle. So why am I using this example as the start of my talk with you? It's to highlight 4 main themes that I hope you will take away from my talk. The first is that research is everywhere. So my day job is being a professor of finance. And in that job, I need to read academic papers. I need to scrutinize them. I was an editor for 6 years, deciding which papers to accept and which to reject from a journal. So you might think, well, why is that relevant to me? Why, most people do not go through life reading academic papers. So why is an academic's view on what research is good? Why does that matter when my job does not involve reading such research? But what I'm hopefully highlighting is research is everywhere. Even if you never read a single academic paper, all the time we're making decisions based on research. So when you choose to breastfeed or bottle feed your kid, that is based on research. If you were to pick up a copy of Men's Health or Women's Fitness or Runner's World, that is giving you advice based on research. Maybe next year you want to run the Reading Half Marathon. Do you want to train using high intensity interval training or low intensity steady state? That is all based on the findings of research. What happens if you're into self-help or self-improvement more generally? There are lots of books out there suggesting the story of success. So Malcolm Gladwell has this 10,000 hours rule, that if you invest 10,000 hours of time, you will be an expert. Perhaps the most popular book right now claims you can develop atomic habits. If you were just to buy the author's book and do what he tells you, he claims to be based on research. Another book said that you could develop a 4-hour work week. You could work for just 4 hours a week if you followed the advice in this book. All of these things claim to be based on research. And maybe you don't like reading stuff because maybe you read a lot in your job. Maybe in your spare time, you like to listen. And if you want to listen, well, where better to listen than TED Talks, really seen as authoritative. So this is the second most viewed TED Talk of all time, about how before a difficult interpersonal situation, such as giving a public speech or having a job interview, go backstage and stand in a power pose with your hands outstretched in a victory celebration. This will put endorphins into your body and this will allow you to outperform. That was behind her talk. She launched a best-selling book on this basis. This was debunked, found not to be there in the data. So this matters because lots of people will have bought her book and listened to her talk believing this to be true. So this stuff really matters. So point number 2 is, yes, this stuff matters. So you might think, but isn't what I'm saying old news? We already know about misinformation and fake news. We know to check the facts. But the punchline of my talk is that just checking the facts is not enough. Even if the facts are 100% accurate, they might still be misleading. So Google was completely accurate in quoting this. That was an accurate quote, but it was just out of context. So it didn't give you the bigger picture. And even this quote itself, there was nothing inaccurate about it. More breastfed participants did have higher IQ. But what is incorrect is the implication that breastfeeding caused this high IQ. And so why I think this is so important is we often think that misinformation is somebody else's problem. Shouldn't the government crack down and regulate and prosecute misinformation? Shouldn't universities fire professors who produce misinformation? Shouldn't publishers refuse to publish books which contain misinformation? But my point is, misinformation is really subtle. Like this, there's nothing wrong with the statement. Nobody could prosecute anyone from making that statement because it's true. What is incorrect is the implications that are drawn from this, and often these are implications that we draw ourselves. So my punchline here is that it's the onus is on us to be on our guard to make sure that we don't fall for misinformation. We can't just rely on the government to fix it for us, because even if the government were fully effective, there are many types of misinformation where what is said is actually true, but it's just the inferences drawn from them which are misleading. So, going to the onus being on us to check stuff, well, why don't we? And by we, I mean me. Why didn't I check? Right, I am a professor of finance. Didn't I know to click through and see the full study? Don't I know that correlation is not causation? Why did I believe this without checking? It's because I make mistakes. We all do, because of our biases. And the most relevant bias here is something known as confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the idea that we have a view of the world, and if we see something that conforms to that view of the world, we accept it uncritically. We don't ask questions. And why? It just feels good. So when you see something you like, it activates the striatum. That is the dopamine-rich area of the brain. It feels just as good as having a laugh with friends or finishing a long run to see something that you like. And notice here, when I speak about biases, people think, well, confirmation bias, that only occurs for something which is ideological. So there might be confirmation bias about gun control or abortion or immigration, things that people have strong views about. But my example highlights that actually confirmation bias can apply to quite subtle things. So I have no strong ideology about breastfeeding, but just the small hunch that something natural has to be better than something man-made. We learned this. We learned that you want natural flavorings, not artificial flavorings. That was enough for me to believe that breastfeeding was causing the higher IQ and the other positive health outcomes. So that's what happens when we see something we like. We accept it uncritically because it lights up the striatum. What if we see something we don't like? An inconvenient truth that contradicts our worldview? Well, number one, we might not even read it to begin with. And number two, if we do read it, we read it trying to tear it apart. Why? Because when we see something we don't like, it triggers the amygdala. That is the part of the brain which induces a fight or flight response. People respond to something they don't like as if they are being attacked by a tiger. So this is the problem, right? This is why even supposedly smart people like me fall for misinformation. Yes, in the cold light of day, I should scrutinize things. I should ask, is it correlation or causation? But we don't think with a clear head when our biases are clouding us. So what is the solution? It's that we need to check everything. Now, this might seem a disappointing fourth point for me to give, because check everything. Is this really realistic? Because you're busy people, but you don't have time to scrutinize every footnote of a study and go into the references. Maybe I can do this as an academic, but with a company to run, we really can't scrutinize this. But what I'm going to highlight is how checking is something that we can do very quickly with common sense. We don't need statistical training, and indeed there is not a single equation in my whole book. So what this highlights is that common sense is often enough. And so what I do in the book is I try to classify misinformation into just 4 categories. Why? There's other great books on misinformation out there, but they give you like the 173 ways in which you can be duped. And that's hard for the reader to remember all of these and put them into practice. So instead, what I do is I classify them into 4 so that they can be memorable. And so I illustrate this in a diagram I call the ladder of misinference. So why do I use the ladder as the graphic? Because when you start from some facts and then you draw implications from them, you are climbing up a ladder. And I call this the ladder of misinference because you might make mistakes when climbing up the ladder, which is why some of the rungs above are broken. So the first misstep up the ladder is a statement is not fact. It may not be accurate. You might quote something, and even if that quote is not a misquote, we've not made anything up, it is not accurate. It does not give the full picture. And this is something which is true, not just in the breastfeeding example, but other health examples. So a very popular book right now is this book called Why We Sleep, a New York Times bestseller by this guy who's highlighting his PhD. Okay, so this is a book that plays into our confirmation bias. We would all love an excuse to stay in bed another hour, and we'd love to believe that these overly eager beavers who wake up at 5 a.m., they will get their comeuppance somehow. And how might they get their comeuppance? Maybe if they're sleep deprived, they could get injured. And indeed, this graph in the book shows that the more you sleep, the lower your chance of injury. Seems really convincing. But if you go back to the original paper from which he takes this chart, you find another chart. And so the actual chart shows that if you have 5 hours of sleep, you have even less injury than not only 6 hours, but 7 hours. But because this doesn't support Matthew Walker's mantra, he just cuts out that bar. Okay, so that is unethical. You should not just be doctoring the data, but there's nothing illegal in this in that he did actually quote this correctly. He just didn't give the whole truth. So again, we need to check the underlying context. Were certain things missed out? And perhaps a very serious case in which this happened is the opioid epidemic. So in the United States, about 650,000 people have died in 20 years due to the overprescription of opioids, which led to overdoses. And if you look around the world, this is millions. It's an extremely sad example. And so why were opioids so prescribed despite their addictiveness? Well, it's because apparently some research in the New England Journal of Medicine has found that addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. So this paper was cited 1,650 times. So let's look at the paper. So here's the first page of the paper. You might think, well, where's the second and where's the third page? Can we see the numbers and the tables? Well, there's nothing else. This is it. This paper, cited so many times, is just a letter to the editor. It is a 5-sentence letter. Based on this 5-sentence letter, people prescribed antibiotics because they just looked at the title. Addiction is rare. We don't need to read the article. It's clear. And it's in the New England Journal of Medicine, so it must be true. Not knowing this was a letter, not an actual study. And even if the person writing the letter is completely accurate, well, the letter refers to people who had one narcotic preparation. Well, maybe one doesn't get you addicted, but 3 or 4 might. And these were people who were hospitalized. So if you're in hospital, then you're given these drugs under a controlled circumstance. Maybe if you are an outpatient and it's not controlled, then you can get addicted because you might take more than you need to. So people just quoted this, not knowing it was a letter, not knowing the context, with quite devastating consequences. Okay, so you might think, well, shouldn't I then just check the facts? Make sure I have the full context and that is enough. Well, unfortunately, it's not enough because of the second misstep up the ladder. Facts are not data. They may not be representative. So let's say even if a fact is 100% accurate, it could be cherry-picked. It could be the exception that does not prove the rule. So if I go back to TED Talks, let's not go to the second most viewed one of all time, but the third. And this is by Simon Sinek, and it led to his book called Start With Why, a global bestseller. And what Simon Sinek claims is that if you have a why, a passion, a purpose, you will become successful. And again, this plays into our confirmation bias, right? We tell our kids, you can do anything that you put your mind to. We just need to want it hard enough. You can achieve anything. And this is backed up by facts. Apple, hugely successful. Nobody can dispute this. The first company to be worth 1 trillion, then the first to be worth 3 trillion. Also, Wikipedia, hugely successful, right? It's clearly surpassed the Encyclopedia Britannica as the world's fountain for knowledge. The Wright brothers, clearly successful. They were the first to launch a test-powered flight. They beat Samuel Pierpont Langley, even though he was far wealthier. But all of these are hand-picked examples. There can be hundreds of other examples where people started with why and failed, but Simon Sinek will never tell you about them because they don't support his viewpoint. So what we would need is something pretty similar to a randomized control trial. So what you do in such a trial is you take some people, you give some of them a drug and see how many of them get better and how many of them get worse. And you give others a placebo and see how many get better and how many get worse. And importantly, your data set, it contains people who took the drug and still got worse. These are companies that started with why and failed. But you will never see examples of companies that start with why and failed in a Simon Sinek book because they don't support his viewpoint. Similarly, we need to consider the people who had the placebo and still got better. Companies that did not start with why and yet they succeeded. And again, Simon Sinek, you'll never see any mention of such examples in his book. So he just ignores the rest of the data. He just handpicks a few facts. He will only show you what supports his view. So you might think, well, the solution to that is large-scale data. Let's make sure we have the full picture, have the entire sample here, not just the green box. But that doesn't work either. Because data is not evidence, it may not be inclusive. So even if we have large-scale data, even if we see the full picture, it might not be evidence. So what do I mean by data and evidence? Right, those seem to be interchangeable words, so why am I trying to distinguish between them? So what is data? That is a series of facts. What is evidence? Where is the time we hear the word evidence said a lot? It's a criminal trial. Right, so in a criminal trial, evidence is only evidence if it points to one particular suspect. So if the evidence suggests that Tom or Dick or Harry could have killed Sarah, that is not evidence because it's consistent with multiple different explanations. So evidence is something with one particular conclusion that it draws. And so if I go back to breastfeeding, this was not evidence because the difference of 5, that could be breastfeeding causes higher child IQ. Or maybe if there are other common factors like family background that both allow a woman to breastfeed and also directly leads to higher child IQ. So as a busy professional with not time to go into the statistics, how can we use common sense to ask ourselves whether there are these common causes, these alternative suspects in a criminal trial? So here's the trick. So when you see a study whose findings you like, imagine that it had the opposite result. So imagine that breastfeeding led to low IQ. We don't like that result. That just doesn't sound right because we think natural things should be good. It triggers our amygdala. We see this as a tiger attack, and so you want to shoot it down. So how would we shoot it down? We might appeal to common causes. We might say, well, perhaps the women who breastfeed are poor. They can't afford formula. And if you can't afford formula, then you're poor, and maybe it's that poverty that directly leads to the lower child IQ. So now that we've alerted ourselves to the possibility of poverty being an explanation, ask ourselves, does it still remain an explanation even though the result is in our direction? Can these common causes explain the higher child IQ, not breastfeeding? And why I think this is so powerful is it highlights that the skills of discernment are already within us. Right, so whenever I see a study being posted on LinkedIn that people don't like the sound of, there is no shortage of comments as to why correlation is not causation, why this is something which might be unreliable. But then these same critical thinking faculties are switched off when we see something that we do like. So the idea of imagining the opposite is just to activate the natural discernment that's already within us to make sure we apply the same discernment to a result we do like as one we don't. So the fourth and final step of the ladder is evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. So a proof is universal. That is true in every situation. So when Archimedes proved the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared, that was true in ancient Greece in 3rd century BC when he did it. But it's also true in Reading in 2024 today. But evidence is only true in a particular context. So if the evidence suggested that Tom killed Sarah and Tom is the husband, that doesn't mean it's always the husband who kills somebody if unfortunately somebody who dies. But often we will claim something is proof wider than the context in which the evidence was gathered. So back to the 10,000 hours rule, Malcolm Gladwell claims that to be successful in any field, from chess to neurosurgery, you have to practice for 10,000 hours. But the evidence he gathered was just on violinists. And violin playing, which is repetitive, where you can practice a given sheet music, that is very different from neurosurgery, where each surgery is going to be very different circumstances. But what about if you took a study in exactly the same context? Is that enough? Well, sadly not. And so one final TED Talk and book, this is Angela Duckworth's really famous work, found that actually grit passion and perseverance, all the things that we think to be true, they're more important than anything else to drive success. And a big finding looked at the military. She took people at the US military in West Point, and this is, to get into West Point is really tough. But even after you've got into West Point, you're not in the army, you have to complete a 6-week training called Beast Barracks. And so she predicted, well, what affects whether you complete Beast Barracks, and a striking result was grit was even more important than fitness. So this is why it became so successful, right? Really surprising that for something like the military, where fitness should matter, she found grit mattered more. But the problem is something known as restriction of range. So to get into West Point to begin with, you already have to be extremely fit. And if there's diminishing returns to fitness, once you're already fit, maybe fitness doesn't matter. That's why something else matters, like your grit. But if you take the average man or woman on the street who dreams of joining the military, they should be working on their fitness, not their grit. A result that you gather in a small subset of people who are already really fit does not apply to the general population. You can't extrapolate. And one final study to hammer home this point, there was a study which looked at, does the use of parachutes reduce the amount of death if people have to jump from an aircraft? You might think this is a no-brainer, but they ran a trial where they had people jump out of an airplane, and the lucky people got a parachute, and unlucky people got no parachute. And shockingly, they found the parachute had no effect. So how could that be? Well, the plane was already grounded. So they jumped 2 feet out of a plane which was already on the ground. And so this was published in the British Medical Journal, but this was a satirical study highlighting the importance of context. We can't just take a result and believe that it applies all the time. So here the idea that parachutes don't matter at 2 feet, well, they might still matter at 10,000 feet. So let me wrap up. I've thrown a lot of you in this past half an hour. So first thing, if you have a statement, check what was actually said. As often it might be quoted out of the context. It might be a letter rather than a scientific study. If you have facts, are you being shown the full picture? Does the author tell you about those with the secret source who failed, or those without the secret source who succeeded? If not, he's being selective. Data is not evidence, right? So if you have large-scale data and there's a strong correlation, maybe it's not causation. And to ask why, imagine you saw the opposite result. How would you knock it down? And finally, evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. Check the context. That might be the setting. Is this violinist when we care about neurosurgeons? Check the range. Is it people who are already very fit when we care about the population as a whole? Okay, well, thanks so much again for the interest. This is the book that I just wrote, which is published by Penguin Random House, which goes into this in much more detail, hopefully in a very simple context. As I mentioned, there's not a single equation there, and I try to put a lot of effort into making this accessible to a general audience. So I hope that might be a useful resource for those of you for whom this is of interest. But let me just stop now and go to the Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex. That was tremendous. A lot of information there and a lot of food for thought. Who would like to ask the first question? Get the ball rolling.
Jonathan's got his hand up. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Alex, thank you. Very interesting. How do we deal with situations where the counterfact data isn't even present? So drug trials where the drug efficacy failed, the study wasn't published, or in Simon Sinek's type examples where the failed companies, we've never heard of them, so we can't talk about them.
Yeah, thank you. And I think if we just don't see that data, just to be skeptical. So you're right that we can only make inferences on what we do see. But if indeed we think that there will be some publication bias there, that's to take this into account. So there might be topics under which there's only one result that people would like to publish, and so we need to be just aware about people's incentives when seeing what's the data out there. So just to give a concrete example of this, there's evidence which claims a link between diversity and company performance. So that's something I clearly would love to be true as an ethnic minority, but you only ever see the likes of McKinsey and BlackRock claiming that diversity improves performance. Why? They would never release a study that diversity worsens performance. Why? Because it would just be bad for their brand. So we need to think about another question that I suggest in the book about the idea of opposites is, if the same authors had found the opposite result, would they have published it? And if they wouldn't, then you might be worried that they've cooked the data to find results that they want. And I actually give example in the book in chapter 5 of where I was asked to do a diversity study myself. It didn't give the results that the person wanted, so they found some alternative data to support what they wanted to support. And so often as academics, we often do publish papers with results that people don't like, just because our goal is scientific research. But when a company releases research, it's often brand building, and therefore they might only have one particular finding that they want to show, which is the one which is the most acceptable one.
Thank you.
Gurpreet, we have some questions in the chat. So can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep. Do you want to go ahead?
So David Thomas asked, do you think that AI chat GPT will make people less likely to use critical thinking?
I think it might do. So on the one hand, you might think, well, ChatGPT and AI, that should be the solution to misinformation. Why? Because that should avoid being too skewed by one study. So if you were to ask ChatGPT, does vaccination lead to autism? Then they might refer to the Andrew Wakefield study in the Lancet and then say this has been completely debunked. And so this avoids the problem of accidentally finding that Andrew Wakefield study and putting too much weight on it. However, what ChatGPT still does, given my knowledge of it, and I have to admit I'm not an AI expert, but what they do is they look at the density of what's out there. And so this looks at the quantity of information out there, not so much the quality. So it could be that if you ask it about the 10,000 hours rule, given that this 10,000 hours rule has been repeated and parroted by lots of other people, they might think, well, this is true because lots of people are saying it's true, not realizing there was only one original source. And the whole idea of correlation versus causation, that is critical thinking that requires us to ask, are there alternative explanations here? Or there's other questions such as, is the context here different from the context in which the data was gathered? And that's something that I wouldn't rely on ChatGPT to do right now, because those are things that we need human judgment in order to do. So I think ChatGPT is certainly useful, and I do use it sometimes in my own research to look up stuff. But just to realize that, just like any tool, it can help us to some degree, but it's not always going to be the last word. So even if a study has found a correlation, ChatGPT says there's a robust correlation, which has been documented by many studies, ask ourselves, are there other potential explanations for this, like those common causes?
Thank you.
There's another question in the chat, which is, do you think there is, this is from Victor Freeney, do you think there is any malevolence behind some of the misinformation?
This is a great question, Victor, because my book is called May Contain Lies. And people might think, well, the word lies is quite inflammatory, because the word lies often refers to two things. Number one, it's a flat out lie where somebody's deliberately doctored the data, such as, say, a deep fake or a deliberate misquote. And number two, it implies malevolence. It implies that somebody is intentionally lying. They know they're lying, but they're lying in order to get some particular benefit. But why I wanted to call this book May Contain Lies is that we want to broaden the idea of what it means to be a lie. So to me, a lie is just the opposite of truth. So somebody can lie to you, despite being truthful, if they're only giving a small part of the picture. And is this me just redefining lie? Who am I to sort of redefine the English language? But we already have the idea of white lie. So a white lie is something which is truthful, but it's still not correct because you're missing stuff out. And so we need to recognize that. And then number two, the malevolence point that Victor asked about is really important, because I think that in many cases, people are not malevolent. They might truly be like true believers and then get carried away due to their biases, just like I'm biased. So again, with diversity, there's people who genuinely want diversity to improve performance. And so even if the study is not particularly watertight, which supports this, it might be that we repost it and share it on social media. And this is not malevolence, it's that we're human. And if we're human, we're more likely to share things that we think to be true. And as a researcher, once we have the result that is true, we might not check for alternative explanations. We will just stop gathering the data at that point. And I think because a lot of misinformation is not malevolent, this makes the problem of misinformation broader, because it's not just produced by a few malevolent people. Indeed, people with good intentions might still be producing it.
Thank you.
Right. Any more questions? I've got one for you. If there's,
I'd like to ask a question, Alex.
Yes, go ahead, Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Alex, hi. No, just on the point that you just made there, it's as if there is a truth to which there are also lies, and how realistic is that, where it can be changing all the time? For instance, like yourself, I'm really interested in, and I would love there to be a positive impact from having more inclusion in the workplace, for example. And, you know, I believe that there is some evidence that proves that, which may or may not be the actual truth. However, there could be a lot of other factors underlying that, to do with, you know, if you're in a workplace that's not used to listening to certain viewpoints from different points of view, there's selective uptake from within that conversation and within that project, for example. So it's really complex, isn't it? It's really, there are no truths and no untruths. There are always shades of unknowns and undercurrents.
I fully agree with this. And so I talked about confirmation bias in my talk, but there's another bias that I speak about in the book, which is called black and white thinking. It's that we like to see the world in black and white terms, and we don't think about the shades of grey. So something is either always better or always good for you, always bad for you. For example, if you take the Atkins diet, carbs are always bad, or breast milk is always good for you, when these things are nuanced. And in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, I have done my own research on this, which I'm putting into the chat right now, which looks at if you have a holistic measure of DEI, which captures many of the things that you're talking about, Linda, such as inclusion, right? So do you actually create a psychologically safe corporate culture where people are willing to speak up? That is correlated with financial performance. But the lazy McKinsey type studies, they reduce DEI to just gender and ethnicity. So this is highly reductive, because this reduces the totality and the humanity of a person just to two things. This suggests that even if you're a white male, you can never add to diversity. Even if your background is humanities and the other people are scientists, even if you're the first person in your family to go to university, even if you're, say, from the north of England, and there's a lot of regional inequality here in the UK, just by having a different accent, people form different inferences. So, so just because there are problems with current DEI studies, that doesn't mean that DEI in general is not going to pay off, but we just need to look beyond the blunt measures that some companies are parading right now. And so there is no like that. And then back to your big question is, what is the truth? I don't think there is something which is like a universal truth. You will just have papers that get you closer and closer to that. And this is why the idea of the ladder of misinference is you can climb up the ladder, but it's very unlikely you're going to get to the top, which is proof. Because again, a proof is universal. Even if you find something is true in a particular context, it might not apply to other contexts, which might be different in terms of different cultural norms.
Thank you. Thanks for adding that richness to the discussion. Thanks.
You're welcome.
There's a question just through another one through the chat window for you, Alex. Mr. Bradley says, what would you say to people who believe we are living in a post-truth society where politicians and businessmen deliberately tell part of the truth, or indeed their own truth, and can now use Gen AI to create videos and so on to back up their truth in quotes? Yeah,
I would agree with you, Mr. Bradley, and indeed my book itself is based on a TED talk I gave a few years ago called What to Trust in a Post-Truth World. So it uses your term post-truth in that talk. And so what this highlights is that while Victor's question was correct in some times, there is no malevolence behind the misinformation. Sometimes there is malevolence, and unfortunately there are some bad actors. And you know that if you are to give a particular claim that support people's viewpoint, then that is something which might go viral even if there's not evidence around it. So when you have conspiracy theories, there are people who don't trust governments, who don't trust large corporations. So if you spark a conspiracy theory that COVID was started by a government or by a corporation that wants to then produce vaccines and make money from those vaccines, that is something which plays into people's distrust of the government or large companies. And now that you can have Gen AI with things like deep fakes to do this is something where it becomes even more problematic. Now, if you point your finger at somebody, 3 fingers point back at you, and I have to acknowledge that my own profession, the academic profession, sometimes has fallen into this, where nowadays some academics can be a bit like rock stars, when in the past all they did was they just wrote papers and sat in a library. So now if you write a famous book and give lots of TED talks, you can be a very high priced keynote speaker. There are concerns, for example, with Francesca Gino's work at Harvard. So she is under investigation for having fabricated the data. Why? Because if she gave a result that people wanted, which sounds cute and innovative, she'd get famous, and she indeed became extremely famous as a professor, but this might now actually be based on fabrications and falsehoods. And so again, what all this means is to avoid putting too much weight on a single study or a single person, because that person's research might be skewed. Instead, what we want to do is look at scientific consensus more generally.
I think we've got quite time for another 1 or 2 questions, quick ones.
Didn't you have a question, Gurpreet?
I did, but I think Alex has covered that actually just in the last point, which is, when it comes to unconscious bias or selective data out of context, I think scientists in particular have been caught up in a number of scandals recently about that. Particularly in certain fields like psychology, where there is a huge problem with reproducibility. I don't know if you want to say a few words around that, Alex.
Yeah, so I guess with scientific papers, sometimes papers get retracted or sometimes papers get overturned because the original result was perhaps luck, and then it's not been replicable. So that was the problem with Amy Cuddy's research. So I don't think people found her research to be fraudulent. So she didn't make up the data, but she might have just been lucky in her original data set, which found the effect of power poses, but nobody has been able to replicate that result. So again, we don't want to put too much weight into one particular person.
There is a question that's come through from Tony G on the chat window. Isn't another kind of disinformation the deliberate manufacture of doubt?
Yeah, I guess it's a good question. And so so there is an important line between what I'm trying to promote, which I would call discernment or skepticism, versus cynicism and being a conspiracy theorist. So there are possibilities. And I posted something on X, and let me see whether I can find it here. So let me share my screen here. This is obviously a cartoon. But Pythagoras is saying the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides, and you've got all of these people here trying to sow doubt in this person and saying, oh, it's fake, and so on. So again, what this means is that if you are to challenge something, and I'm certainly happy to have challenge, to encourage challenge, it has to be based on something, right? So it has to be based on, here's an alternative explanation, or here the data hasn't controlled for a particular factor. But what we see sometimes when I post something on LinkedIn that people don't like the sound of, and it's not just me, anybody, there will be comments such as, I haven't read the paper, but I don't agree. Well, read the actual paper. That's just like saying, I've never eaten at this restaurant, but the food is lousy. So you couldn't have a restaurant review without actually actually trying the food there. And so sometimes we respond to something based on just the conclusion. And this is again a form of confirmation bias, is that we're responding to it like a tiger attack rather than looking at the actual argument and the data itself. So Tony is absolutely right. So on the one hand, I've tried to encourage us not to fall for stuff that we want to be true, but similarly we shouldn't reject out of hand something we don't like because it's an inconvenient truth, and that's an important other side of the picture.
Brilliant. Thanks. Alex, one last question from David. You've got your hand up, Dave.
Yeah, with the election announced yesterday, do you think that our journalists need to be doing a better job in actually thinking through and questioning candidates, politicians?
Absolutely. And so actually another thing that this book came out from was a handy guide that I wrote for journalists called Evaluating Research. So, and this was something I just put on my website. I gave talks to things such as the National Union of Journalists on this. This is not so much on politicians, but this is about how to scrutinize studies. Why? Because journalists can always find a study to support whatever they want to support. And maybe this could be a study supporting their favourite politician, because if the politician, part of their manifesto is to raise taxes on X, they can find a study claiming that raising taxes always works or raising taxes backfires. This is now in the appendix of the book that I've just written, but I certainly, just to your point, think that journalists are really important in terms of either combating or contributing to misinformation. And so this is why even before the book, I wrote this simple guide for how journalists can scrutinise papers. And even though this was based on academic papers, I think the same would be true of a study, or sort of a statement by a politician. Just ask, what is the evidence behind what they're saying? So when Bernie Sanders said the people who destroyed Wall Street, they don't get fired, they get raises in their salaries, people just accepted it. It sounded so bad, it must be true. And actually the evidence suggests that the people who were CEOs of Lehman and Bear Stearns, they lost a lot of money. Now, still what they did is really bad, but the idea that they benefited from this, it's not true. And this is true on both sides of the political spectrum. So the Republicans claim that one of the precursors to Obamacare said that there would be a panel of psychiatrists who would triage whether you were productive enough in society to warrant medical care or whether you should be euthanized. And so people like Sarah Palin said, well, this would lead to Obama having a death panel of bureaucrats who would decide that her baby with Down syndrome would not be worth having medical care. And this was never in any of the bill which proposed the healthcare reform, but people were just claiming this without evidence. So the journalist should say, well, what is the clause within HR 3200, which was the actual document which says this? But often people don't ask, because if it's so shocking that you couldn't make it up, then people think it must be true, and they accept it uncritically.
Brilliant. Well, we're up to time, and that was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I hope everybody joins me in thanking Alex for a wonderful chat. Really wonderful. Learned a lot. And if you want to recap what you've learned today, remember that we are recording it. It will be on our website in a few days' time. I'd just like to finish off. Thank you very much, Alex. I'd just like to finish off. If you would like to find out more about ethical reading, please do go to our website. Have a look at the events that are coming up. There are two in particular that I wanted to mention. One was around business ethics in schools. This is really about taking business ethics to secondary school pupils. That's the beginning of June. And then towards the 26th, on the 26th of June, we've got our environmental sustainability group. So if you could have a look at that, and if you would like to participate, go to our website again and let us know. That would be great. We're always looking for volunteers. So if you would like to volunteer, that would be fantastic. Until the next time, have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for joining.
Well, thanks very much for all the kind comments. Really appreciate you hosting me, and that really appreciate everybody joining.